Every 7 minutes in America, a woman dies at the hands of her partner. Jessica Chambers, at just 19, suffered a brutal attack from someone she knew she was burned alive. In excruciating agony, engulfed in flames, the girl tried to utter the killer's name until her last breath. This story is yet another reminder of how cautious women need to be today. I hope this account will help you protect yourself and your loved ones from harm. Jessica was born on February 2, 1995, in Clarksdale, Mississippi. Her parents divorced when she was just 3 years old. Later, her father remarried a woman who already had children, so Jessica gained 7 step siblings. Despite having such a large family, the girl's childhood was not easy. Her father was involved in the production of illegal substances for a long time until he was arrested and imprisoned. Jessica grew up in a harsh, marginalized environment. However, unlike many other criminals, her father managed to break the vicious cycle of crime after his release from prison. He got a job as a mechanic at a local auto repair shop. Jessica grew up in the small town of Courtland, Mississippi. In fact, it was more like a village, with a population of less than 500 people at the time of the events described. However, unlike some other small settlements, Courtland became a haven for not-so-upstanding individuals. The crime rate here was, on average, 50% higher than in the country as a whole. Historically, most of the local residents were somehow connected to the criminal world. But young Jessica seemed to pay no attention to this. She grew up peacefully and studied in high school, where she was a cheerleader and an excellent student thanks to her academic abilities. She had a high GPA upon graduation. However, Jessica constantly faced problems in her personal life. For a long time, she lived with her mother, who had a difficult personality. When the girl started dating a boy who lived across the street, her mother reacted extremely negatively. The woman tried to control her daughter and disapproved of her choice of boyfriend. Due to constant conflicts, Jessica was eventually forced to move out from her mother's place. Fortunately, she didn't have to go far, just a few blocks away, where her father lived with his new wife, Debbie. This even somewhat improved Jessica's relationship with her mother, so the girl regularly stayed at her place. However, the teenager's life was quite stressful, and in 2012, another tragic blow occurred. Her brother, to whom Jessica was very close, died in a car accident. This loss knocked her off course for a long time. But despite everything, Jessica graduated from high school and got a job at a supermarket as a clothing saleswoman to start earning a living. However, behind the idyllic facade, there was also a dark side to the girl's life. She occasionally smoked marijuana. Once, this even led to her arrest. But even this did not worsen people's attitudes towards Jessica, as she continued to be a kind and good person. And against the backdrop of the criminal records of most of the town's residents, her detention for prohibited substances seemed like a trifle not worth paying attention to. However, it was after this that a series of events began that might have ultimately led the girl to a tragic end. 19-year-old Jessica was dating 28-year-old Travis Sanford, who was serving time in prison at the time. The guy's criminal past did not bother the girl. She patiently waited for his release. After all, Jessica grew up in an atmosphere associated with crime since childhood, and the town itself had a bad reputation in this regard. Even her own father had served time in prison before getting on the path of an honest life. So for Jessica, things like jail time was something commonplace and not worth special attention. On December 6, 2014, at approximately 4 p.m., Jessica was visiting her mother, Lisa. She planned to quickly stop by the gas station and return immediately. However, the girl disappeared for a long time. The trip should have taken a maximum of 10-15 minutes. But even after 2 hours, Jessica still hadn't shown up. Worried, Lisa sent her daughter a message asking when she would be back home. But there was no response. Then the woman tried calling Jessica's cell phone, but again, she didn't answer. Lisa's anxiety grew. She called one more time. This time, her daughter picked up. Barely audible, she whispered into the phone that she would be home soon and that everything was fine. This was extremely unusual. Normally, Jessica liked to listen to music loudly, and wherever she was, there was always some noise in the background. But this time, there was dead silence on the other end. This greatly alarmed Lisa, but she calmed down a bit as she managed to reach her daughter, who assured her that everything was okay. After a short conversation, they said goodbye. No one could have imagined that in just a few hours, the girl's parents would receive terrible news. Around 8 p.m., 911 emergency services received a disturbing call from 2 local residents. They reported that a Kia Rio car was burning in the Batesville area. Firefighters arrived at the scene in just 2 minutes. But as soon as they began to extinguish the fire, a dark figure emerged from the adjacent wooded area. The rescuers turned one of their vehicles so that its headlights illuminated the approaching silhouette. What they saw shocked them to the core. Stumbling towards them, barely able to move her legs, was a girl whose body was almost completely burned and disfigured by terrible burns. She was so severely mutilated by the fire that it was simply impossible to recognize her. With a pleading moan, the girl stretched out her charred arms to the rescuers and then fell to the ground just 2 meters away from them, no longer having the strength to move. There she lay, waiting for the ambulance to arrive. By that time, the car had almost completely burned out. The flames mainly engulfed the engine compartment and the interior, while the trunk suffered minimal damage. While one part of the fire brigade continued to battle the blaze, one of the rescuers set about providing first aid to the victim. He wrapped her in a blanket, knowing that after severe burns, a person often feels cold. Soon, police officers arrived at the scene to question the 2 men who had discovered the burning car and called the emergency services. They were clearly alarmed by the horrific condition of the burned girl. They immediately suspected that this fire was no accident. The victim needed to be taken to the hospital as soon as possible. The sight was gruesome. The girl was completely covered in burns, with only charred underwear remaining on her body. One of the law enforcement officers supported her, trying to calm her down, and asked a few questions. The victim's entire body was covered in third-degree burns, her hair and eyebrows completely singed off. The girl couldn't even speak normally. The policeman first tried to find out her name, but she could barely utter individual sounds. He had to lean in very close to her face, almost pressing his ear to her mutilated lips to make out anything at all. At first, he misheard the girl's name, but looking into her eyes, he recognized her as Jessica Chambers, a local resident. Then he asked who had done this to her. Mustering her last strength, the unfortunate victim tried to say the name of her attacker. The police officer thought he heard the word water. At that moment, the girl lost consciousness. Meanwhile, paramedics arrived at the scene. They immediately tried to revive Jessica by performing cardiac massage. It worked. The girl regained consciousness for a moment. One of the eyewitnesses recognized the burned-out car as Jessica's vehicle. In such a small town, everyone knew each other. So, thanks to the prompt actions of the medics, Jessica briefly regained consciousness. The police immediately tried to find out who else was in the car with her right before the tragedy. A crowd of onlookers had already gathered around the burning vehicle. Their noise and whispering greatly interfered with the investigation. It was extremely difficult for the police officer to make out the quiet whispers of the burned girl. But despite everything, he managed to catch the name Eric, although he wasn't entirely sure of what he heard. The law enforcement officer asked someone to bring a sheet of paper and a pen so that Jessica could write down the suspect's name herself. But unfortunately, this turned out to be impossible. The girl's hands were too badly damaged by the fire. She could no longer move them, let alone write. After asking the victim several times, the policeman tried to confirm whether anyone present in the car was named Derek or Eric. They didn't have time to find out anything else. The paramedics had already loaded Jessica into the ambulance to get her to the hospital as quickly as possible. On the way to the hospital, the medics continued to question Jessica, trying to find out the name of the perpetrator. To make sure they understood correctly what the victim's name was, the paramedic asked again if her name was indeed Jessica Chambers. The girl nodded affirmatively in response. After that, she tried again to say the name of her attacker. The medics suggested options Eric or Derek, but Jessica shook her head in denial. The ambulance took the girl to Regional 1 Health Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee. There, doctors began a desperate fight for her life. Meanwhile, the police informed Jessica's parents of the terrible news about the fire and their daughter's critical condition. The family was an hour's drive away from the medical center where the girl was taken. Ben, Jessica's father, picked up her mother, Lisa, and together they rushed to the hospital, hoping to see their daughter alive and find out what had happened to her. The road seemed endless, thoughts of the worst never leaving the parents' minds for a moment. They arrived in Memphis sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning. When Lisa entered the ward and saw the body mutilated by fire, she immediately recognized her daughter in it, even though the girl was burned beyond recognition. Jessica's eyes were closed. She was barely breathing. The mother leaned over the bed and whispered in her daughter's ear that everything would be all right now, since she and her father were there. But a few minutes later, Jessica Chambers died from her injuries. The fire had damaged 93% of her body, leaving only a small area of her neck unaffected. The burns were so deep, mostly second and third degree, that the girl had virtually no chance of survival. Almost all the residents of the town, over 400 people, came to the funeral chapel to say goodbye to 19-year-old Jessica. Among them were her classmates, who left touching inscriptions and memories on the white metal coffin with permanent markers. Everyone was troubled by the same question: who could have committed such a brutal crime against the young cheerleader? Some leaned towards the version that it could have been an accident, perhaps a car crash. But the police immediately rejected this assumption, since at the scene, neither on the road nor on the roadside, they found no traces of another vehicle. Moreover, despite the fact that the car had completely burned out, there were no characteristic signs of impact damage on it. The investigators considered an intentional murder the most likely scenario, especially since Jessica tried to name the attacker's name until the very end. To stir up the public, the police released information about this incident to the media. A reward of $1,000 was announced for any information that would help find the perpetrator. Detectives visited the home of the victim's mother, Lisa, to restore the chronology of events on the last day of Jessica's life with her help. The investigators were also interested in who the girl communicated with and whether there were any suspicious or potentially dangerous individuals among her acquaintances. Lisa said that around 2 p.m., her daughter had come home and gone to take a nap in the living room. At 4:25 p.m., she was awakened by a call on her cell phone. After talking to someone for a few minutes, Jessica told her mother that she needed to stop by the gas station nearby. There were no interesting places in this area. The only place the girl could have gone to was the local 24-hour store. The detectives decided to question the cashier who was on shift that fateful day. Maybe he had noticed something suspicious and could share useful information with the police. At the store, they were met by Ali Alani. He reported that he had indeed seen a girl who matched the description of the murdered Jessica. The salesman fully cooperated with the investigation. He provided access to the surveillance camera recordings. The video showed that at 6:25 p.m., Jessica approached the doors but did not enter the store because someone called out to her. The girl looked back and waved to someone who remained off camera. Then she headed in that direction and also disappeared from the camera's view. For several minutes, she was not visible. It is unknown what happened during that time. Then Jessica reappeared at the store's doors, went inside, paid for gas, and drove away. The police did not notice anything suspicious in Ali's behavior, but the local residents had a different opinion. When it became known that the cashier was the last person who had definitely seen Jessica alive, many in the town believed that it was he who had killed her. There were even witnesses who claimed that Alani was a member of a local criminal gang. So the person who first helped the investigation with valuable information suddenly fell out of favor with the community. However, the law enforcement officers soon refuted his involvement in the crime. Ali had an ironclad alibi. Surveillance camera recordings confirmed that the man had been at his workplace all evening and all night. Moreover, he successfully passed a lie detector test. In the end, the detectives had to appear on local television with an official statement to protect Ali from the people's anger. The head of the police personally announced that the store clerk was not involved in Jessica Chambers' death. Gradually, passion subsided, and the cashier was left alone. By that time, the investigators already had preliminary results of the examinations. Forensic experts established that the girl had been doused with a flammable liquid, most likely gasoline or kerosene, and then set on fire. This was what caused the terrible burns that left her no chance of survival. The flames that engulfed her fuel-soaked clothing were impossible to extinguish. It's terrifying to even imagine the torment Jessica endured before her heart stopped in the hospital. At the burned-out car, charred scraps of fabric were found, which belonged to the victim's underwear. Chemical analysis confirmed the presence of traces of gasoline on them. Interrogating the town's men one by one, the detectives tried to find someone named Derek or Eric, and also closely watched Jessica's official boyfriend Travis Sanford. However, the latter had to be crossed off the list of suspects, since at the time of the attack, he was in prison. The public continued to help the investigation in their own way. At first, they almost lynched Ali, who was later officially acquitted, and now the rumor mill was accusing Jessica's father, Ben Chambers. Many believed that having a criminal record in the past automatically made him a suspect in the murder of his own daughter. Some even recalled that Ben had once expressed racist views, and his daughter had just started a relationship with a boy of a different skin color. Could the enraged father have decided to teach the disobedient Jessica a lesson? To deflect suspicion from himself and not interfere with the investigation, Ben agreed to take a polygraph test and provided an alibi. After that, he also publicly emphasized that he had no prejudice against people of other races. Despite his criminal past, the man insisted that he loved his daughter very much and would never have harmed her. Meanwhile, the detectives talked to the victim's closest friend, Keisha. The girl said that on the day of the tragedy, she and Jessica had walked around town together and then rode in a car. Closer to noon, they were joined by 27-year-old Quinton Tellis. The young people chatted a bit, smoked marijuana, after which Jessica and Kesha dropped Quinton off at the same 24-hour store where Jessica was last seen alive. The guy had a rather bad reputation in town and problems with the law. He had been detained for theft, violation of the inviolability of the home, and assault. Quinton had met Jessica only a couple of weeks before her death, so they were not well acquainted. Upon learning about this connection, the investigators immediately contacted Tellis to talk. At the meeting, he behaved very amiably and willingly answered questions. Quinton reported that he did not know Jessica all that well. Allegedly, they had communicated for a very short time and were generally just acquaintances. On that ill-fated day, he met the girls by chance, and then they simply gave him a ride to the store. Of course, the guy denied any involvement in the subsequent tragic events. Quinton's story sounded quite plausible. Moreover, during the interrogation, he remained calm and at ease. Then the investigators asked Tellis if he knew anyone named Derek or Eric. After all, these were the names Jessica mentioned before her death. Quinton immediately recalled Derek Holmes, who allegedly behaved a bit strangely with Jessica. He said that Derek had repeatedly pestered the girl with offers to date, but she refused every time. This happened on the day Quinton was riding in the car with the friends Derek allegedly tried to hit on Chambers again. The police became interested in this information. Soon, the detectives visited Derek Holmes' home to talk. Despite some oddities, he did not arouse particular suspicion among the investigators. The guy had an alibi for the night of the murder. He was at home then, massaging his mother's feet. It sounds a bit strange, but the fact is that the woman suffered from diabetes, and such procedures helped her fight the complications of the disease. Derek's mother confirmed that her son had not left the house that night and had indeed been taking care of her. But the most important thing was that Derek refuted Quinton's words. He stated that he had not seen Jessica at all that day and had never behaved inappropriately with her. Other mutual acquaintances confirmed this. Even the victim's best friend, Keisha, noted that only Quinton Tellis was in the car with them that day. It seemed that the latter had been caught lying for the first time. The police officers' trust in this guy began to wane. Nevertheless, the detectives decided to return to the starting point of the investigation and continue the search for the possible perpetrator. They conducted interviews with more than 100 young people, including all those named Eric or Derek. But this yielded no results. Meanwhile, public outrage only grew, as most of the interrogated were African Americans. People were already openly accusing the police of bias and racial profiling. The last people the law enforcement officers talked to as part of this case were George and Mentor. Their fingerprints and even saliva samples were taken. Mentor attracted particular attention from investigators because he had communicated with Jessica via Messenger just a couple of days before her death. However, after questioning both guys, the police once again reached a dead end. George and Mentor had reliable alibis, confirmed by several witnesses. They denied any involvement in the girl's murder and insisted that they had been friends for many years. Despite all the efforts of law enforcement, the investigation stalled for a whole 2 months. A new lead appeared only when one of the local residents, walking around the neighborhood, accidentally stumbled upon Jessica's cell phone. He immediately handed the find over to the police. Specialists managed to recover data from the device, the last message in the messenger, the call list. It turned out that on the day of the attack, the girl had been texting with an unknown number. That man was openly flirting with her, trying to spark interest in an intimate relationship, but Jessica kept her distance and made it clear that she was not interested in such offers. It later turned out that the persistent admirer was none other than Quinton Tellis, the same one who had previously assured the police that he barely knew the victim and had not said a word about flirting with her. The detectives summoned the guy for another interview. Pressed by the evidence, he eventually admitted to having an intimate relationship with Jessica. Allegedly, they had sex more than once right in her car. However, few believed these revelations. The correspondence indicated that the girl had rejected Quinton's advances, but he continued to insist that on that fatal night, there had been no intimacy between them and that he had not been at the crime scene at all. Investigators visited Tellis' home with a search warrant. In the barn, they found a canister of gasoline. But this was nothing extraordinary. Many car owners keep fuel in stock at home. When asked to show his cell phone, Quinton replied that he had deleted all messages from Jessica as soon as he learned about her death. This explanation seemed extremely suspicious to the cops, but the guy stood his ground impassively. Why would he keep correspondence with a deceased girl with whom he definitely would not have a relationship anymore? Suddenly, Quinton stated that he had an alibi for the time of Jessica's murder. He said that he had just gone to the Fred store, where he had bought a prepaid card for his girlfriend from Louisiana. Allegedly, he wanted to help her with money for a trip to visit him in this way. The police went to that store to check this alibi. Indeed, at 8:26 p.m., Quinton had paid at the checkout. But the place where Jessica's car was set on fire was just a 15-minute drive from there, so the guy could well have made it there to cover his tracks and then returned. Unfortunately, the investigators lacked evidence to prove his involvement in the crime. In a desperate attempt to find clues, the cops took a closer look at Travis Sanford, the victim's official boyfriend, who was serving time in prison at the time of the tragedy. What if he found out about Jessica's probable affair with Quinton and decided to get even with his unfaithful girlfriend through hired criminals? However, this version had to be discarded. Travis physically could not have been involved in the murder of his girl. Moreover, upon learning about her death, he was genuinely distraught and seemed to know nothing about her relationship with Quinton Tellis. The investigation reached a dead end. For 6 months, no new information appeared. Suddenly, one of the police analysts, carefully studying the data from the cell phones of Quinton Tellis and Jessica Chambers, discovered an interesting detail. It turned out that both phones were in the town of Batesville at a certain point on that fateful day, very close to the place where the girl's burnt car with her body was later found. However, by that time, Quinton was already behind bars in Louisiana, serving a sentence for fraud. The investigators visited Tellis in prison again. He readily agreed to talk and confirmed that he had indeed been in Batesville that day. At the same time, he insisted that he had arrived there much later, after the attack on Jessica, and had nothing to do with her death at all. However, during several interrogations, his testimony changed more than once. According to one version, Quinton and his friend allegedly met the girl on the highway, sold her illegal psychotropic substances, I think you understand what I mean, after which they parted ways. Allegedly, all that time, his buddy nicknamed Big Mike was with him. But no one believed this story. It contradicted Jessica's friend's testimony too strikingly. When the detectives visited Big Mike and asked him about Quinton, he did not confirm meeting with him that day. It seemed that the main suspect was lying to the police again, as they had suspected. After Quinton was caught in a lie, he changed his testimony once more. Now the guy claimed that he had indeed been in the car with Jessica and her friend. They had hung out together until about 7 in the evening. Allegedly, they chatted a bit, smoked, and then went their separate ways. Quinton continued to claim that he had nothing to do with the girl's death. Despite his assurances, it was obvious that Quinton was stunned and frightened by how the investigation was progressing. All this only heightened suspicions about him. 14 months had passed since Jessica died. On February 24, 2016, the investigators on this case called a press conference. They announced that they finally had a prime suspect. It turned out to be Quinton Tellis. The detectives said they had collected enough evidence indicating this young man's involvement in the brutal crime against the girl. However, the community reacted to this statement rather skeptically. Many were convinced that the police were simply trying to pin the blame on an innocent African American. The trial of Quinton Tellis began on October 10, 2017, in the town of Batesville. The prosecution spoke first. The prosecutors emphasized that the defendant was the last person to see Jessica alive. The relationship between the young people was complicated. The girl rejected Quinton's advances, while he constantly pestered her. Moreover, there was confirmation that during the car arson, Tellis was near the crime scene. According to the prosecutors, this is what happened. Quinton attacked Jessica and strangled her until she lost consciousness. Deciding that the girl was dead, he tried to get rid of the body and destroy the evidence he staged an arson. To do this, the perpetrator even went home for a canister of gasoline, which he kept in the barn. Upon returning, he doused Jessica and her car with gasoline and set them on fire. But the girl suddenly regained consciousness and managed to get out of the burning car. However, the terrible burns she suffered left her no chance of survival. Quinton's lawyers built their defense relying on the victim's last words. After all, their client's first and last name did not sound like Derek or Eric, which Jessica mentioned before her death. In addition, the defense appealed to the fact that around 8 in the evening, Just minutes before the report of the burning car, Tellis was buying a top-up card for his girlfriend from Louisiana at the store. This is confirmed by cash receipts. According to the lawyers, in such a short period of time, their client simply could not physically have made it from the store to the crime scene. Then the prosecutors presented to the court a map compiled based on the data on the movements of Jessica and Quinton's cell phones on the day of the murder. As it turned out, most of the time that day, their locations coincided. However, from 6:49 p.m. to 7:26 p.m., neither of the phones showed any activity. The accusers insisted that it was then, at approximately 7:50 p.m., that the killer went home for gasoline. And then, after making a short stop, he returned to the crime scene again. His mobile phone locator confirms this. It is noteworthy that during all that time, neither Jessica nor Quinton sent each other any messages or called. All this only heightened suspicions about Tellis' involvement in the murder. However, the lawyer insisted that there simply were not enough cell towers in the town for accurate determination of mobile device locations. Means of communication could give incorrect information. These facts were confirmed by an independent expert. Moreover, the surveillance camera recordings never clearly showed Quinton behind the wheel of the car. The license plates also remained indecipherable. The defense also mentioned the message sent from Jessica's phone at 7:43 p.m. In it, Quinton wished the girl good night and wrote that he was looking forward to seeing her the next day. The prosecutors parried that the suspect could have purposely sent these messages to create an alibi for himself. They referred to the testimony of the victim's best friend, who claimed that Quinton had never actually appealed to Jessica. When the arguments of the parties were almost exhausted, the defense attorney made the last move, extremely unpleasant for the prosecution. She drew the jury's attention to signs of racial profiling and bias in the actions of the investigation, since the suspects were mostly African American men. The prosecutors rejected such accusations. According to them, they had confirmation that Quinton had repeatedly tried to achieve intimacy with Jessica, but she refused him every time. The accusers made public their numerous correspondence, where the girl reacted to Tellis' advances very reservedly. Despite this, the defendant himself continued to insist that they did have consensual sex. He even did not hesitate to describe in detail the position and place in the car where he allegedly made love to Jessica. But, of course, this did not prove anything. The prosecution remained adamant. Tellis was lying, and the real picture of that day was as follows. Enraged by the refusal, Quinton attacked the girl right in the car, then took her far from his home and set her on fire there. Unrequited feelings became the motive for this terrible murder. When the jury retired to deliberate on the verdict, they could not reach an agreement. Even after additional time for reflection, the jurors could not definitively either convict or acquit Quinton. Both the second and third attempts to reach unanimity failed, so the court was forced to declare the trial inconclusive. On September 24, 2018, a retrial began. It was largely similar to the previous one, with one exception. This time, the prosecution called as a witness a burn specialist who had examined Jessica's body. The expert confirmed that with such terrible injuries, the girl physically could not have spoken clearly. That's why the rescuers heard some other name instead of Quinton. The prosecutors also provided autopsy results that revealed traces of beatings on the victim's body. According to the prosecution, this indicated a struggle between the victim and the attacker. At the second trial, the prosecution felt much more confident and was determined to obtain a guilty verdict for Tellis. But again, the jury's verdict could not be reached. Meanwhile, Quinton himself calmly lived his life. On August 8, 2015, he even got married. But on that very day, in the city of Monroe, Louisiana, another tragedy occurred: the murder of a 34-year-old student named Ming Jingzhu. She was found dead with numerous stab wounds in her own home. About 10 days after her death, when the body had already begun to decompose and give off a characteristic stench, forensic experts counted as many as 30 deep stab wounds on it. Obviously, the girl had been killed with particular cruelty. Unraveling this tangle, investigators tracked the victim's banking transactions. It turned out that shortly before her death, Ming had withdrawn a large sum of cash, for which she had purchased a fake prescription for painkillers from some man. She picked up the medicine from the pharmacy, presenting this false document. Ming Jingzhu drove to the pharmacy in a car driven by a dark-skinned man. After checking the car's numbers, the cops recognized Quinton Tellis in him. Camera recordings captured him a few hours before the girl's murder. And already after her death, someone withdrew over $1,000 from the victim's card. Thanks to the ATM video, it was possible to establish the identity of the criminal. It turned out to be Quinton again. Everything pointed to his involvement in this brutal murder. Tellis was charged with the murder of Ming Jingzhu and theft of money from a bank card. Unfortunately, in this case, the prosecution lacked evidence against the suspect. The jury found Quinton guilty only of stealing funds, for which he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. In November 2022, another trial took place in the Jessica Chambers case. This time, Quinton Tellis was acquitted. The prosecutors failed to convince the jury of his involvement in the brutal crime against the cheerleader. There was not enough evidence for this. So far, the relatives of both murdered girls have not seen justice. Their families refuse to believe in the amazing coincidence that Quinton was nearby every time a murder occurred. Jessica and Ming's loved ones are convinced that Tellis is the real killer. They are disappointed by the system's inability to bring him to justice. In October 2021, Jessica Chambers' mother passed away in the hospital. The cause of her death was never established, but relatives tend to think that the woman simply could not withstand the loss of her daughter and the disappointment in justice. The deaths of 2 young girls a few years apart left more questions than answers. What do you think about this mysterious and chilling story? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you liked this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. That's all for now. See you next time.